Okay, fantastic. So it's come up to the hour. I can see the attendees are starting to rocket up. So thank you everyone for joining and good morning or good afternoon to our global audience. And thank you again for registering for this webinar discussion, More Than Money, Accelerating Water and Energy Infrastructure. I'm Luke Brett from Reuters Events, head up our renewables and hydrogen portfolio here. Um, and I wanted to start with the boring stuff, if you like, just the housekeeping. We really want this to be dynamic and for you, the audience and network. So please make the most of the questions and comments box. Our moderator will try to get through as many questions as possible. And a reminder too that this is being recorded and we will share the webinar after the webinar recording after this is finished. So today's webinar is in partnership with GHG. They are a global professional services company. Your host today will be Tej Gida, Vice President and Global Leader of Future Energy. He's based in North America. And you'll also have Anna Jacobson, EMA Sustainability, Resilience and ESG Leader, who is based in the UK. We also have speakers from We Mean Business Coalition, Crack and Flex, which is part of Octopus Energy Group, Engie, Pacific Gas and Electric, City of Toronto, and all these speakers will be introducing themselves further later. Look, we have a busy schedule today, so I don't want to waste any more time. Let's jump straight in and hand over to Tej for him to kickstart the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone that's joining us today. It's wonderful to see you. Wonderful to have a fantastic panel of speakers today as well. So for me, deeply vested in the energy space, it's been really interesting, this journey getting new water and energy infrastructure developed. We know it has to happen, but we have seen inertia in the system. A lot of companies, including ours, have set commitments around the energy transition in particular. So let's start off by talking with Molly Walton to see how we're doing. Molly is Deputy Director, Energy at the We Mean Business Coalition, where she directs and coordinates the coalition's approach. Before that, she worked for Breakthrough Energy, the International Energy Agency, and the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Molly, absolutely great to have you today. I was hoping you could start us off this morning.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone and with the rest of the panelists. As Tej said, I was asked to give a bit of a high-level overview of the state of the energy transition. And for me to understand sort of where we need to go, I find we need to sort of start with talking about where we are. And I think this is actually sort of the conversation du jour, right? These days, it's a bit of a theme for this year, given that this year marks the finalization of the first global stock take for the Paris Agreement. And so if we look at a few indicators, right, where exactly are we? I think there's a lot of good news that we should highlight, right? If we're looking at where we're at, many of the solutions that we need are already available, right? We're reaching tipping points of mass adoption and declining costs. If we look at power, you could argue that we're already at a tipping point in power. Annual renewable capacity additions continue to break records. In 2022, we saw that solar and wind made up 3/4 of new global capacity. That's significant. We look at transport, right? EVs are increasingly cost competitive with ICE vehicles. The latest analysis from IEA shows that EVs now account for 15% of the global car market. That's up from 5% just 2 years ago. That's a pretty significant change. And we're also seeing that companies are taking action, right? I think everyone will speak to that today. They're continuing to decarbonize their own business operations, but also increasingly looking at decarbonization across supply chains. And what we see with We Mean Business, there's over 10,000 companies, right, who are taking action on climate through We Mean Business Coalition partner initiatives. That can be through SBTI, that's through the SME Climate Hub, that's through demand-side initiatives like RE100, EV100. We're also seeing hard to abate sectors coming together to drive supply and demand for net zero materials and products through things like Steel Zero, Concrete Zero, FMC, MPP, lots of examples of collaboration and work that's being done on the business side to drive the energy transition. But, right, there's a bit of a but. We see that emissions are still rising, right? We see that methane emissions in particular remain stubbornly high. Fossil fuels are remaining entrenched in the system. And if we look at the slate of technologies that we need, technologies and solutions that we need for the energy transition, according to the IEA, just two are on track with net zero by 2050. That's EVs and lighting. There's a lot of yellows, right? If we're looking at that traffic light system, which is good news, but it also indicates we have some more work to do. And so I think the next step is, okay, we've talked about sort of a stock take. What do we need to do to accelerate the transition, right? What are the opportunities? What are some of the barriers, key levers that we need to pull to ensure that we're able to have emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050? And a few things come to mind. First, I would say that governments need to be bold and they need to be ambitious, right? They need to give businesses the confidence to invest, to build, and to reinvest at scale in the clean energy economy. They can do this a lot of different ways. Some of the sort of most obvious ones are setting policies that are going to accelerate the clean energy transition and setting targets and timelines for the phase out of fossil fuels that's in line with 1.5 so that everyone is coalescing around what needs to happen or by when. That can provide real confidence in terms of the direction we need to go. The second is that we need to shift the investment ratio from what it is about 1-to-1 clean to fossil today to where the IEA says we need to get by 2030, which is 9-to-1. That includes sort of supply, end use, and energy efficiency. And we need to ensure that while we're scaling a lot of the technologies that we have today to have those emissions by 2030, that we're not neglecting the investments, the research and development that we need in other solutions that we're going to need in sort of the back half in 2030 and 2040s to ensure that we're going to reach net zero. The third thing I would say is we need to, and that's something I think we'll talk quite a bit about today, is we need to address the barriers that are standing in the way of faster action, right? There's a lot of them. Some of them include, I think importantly, there's been a lot of conversations around planning and permitting and land acquisition. We've seen examples, right, of how slow project permitting timelines have led to the abandonment of renewable projects. We also need to address value chain development. This means both sort of materials, but also the skill sets that we're going to need in the clean energy economy. We also need to scale financing, right, in particular for developing countries and economies. And finally, there's a big question mark around or a need to invest and scale the enabling infrastructure. This is everything from charging infrastructure to transmission and distribution. These are some of the things that we need to pay attention to. I think the fourth thing is we also need to leverage opportunities and head off potential choke points. And one of those that I want to highlight in particular, because it's part of the conversation today, is around water, right? We know that the energy sector accounts for around 10% of global energy withdrawals. We also know that a transition to clean energy is going to reduce that. But we still are going to need to pay attention to, as I said, potential choke points, but also ensuring that water is included whenever we're assessing the physical, economic, or environmental viability of projects. And I think one example of that, right, is if we're looking at the use of electrolysis to produce green hydrogen, right? There's been a lot of conversations of doing this in renewable rich, but water-stressed regions. That doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means we need to account for that and understand how those intersections work to make sure that we're making the best of the opportunity and not causing unintended consequences. On the other side, I think one thing that maybe gets lost sometimes in the conversation is the role that the water sector can play in decarbonization strategies, right? I think one of those examples is energy recovery. I think that's a huge opportunity. Wastewater contains significant amount of embedded energy that if it was harnessed, some of the analysis that was done at IEA showed that it could cover more than half of the electricity needs of municipal wastewater utilities. That's something that needs to be incorporated and accounted for. And I think this really highlights why the integrated approach is so critical, right? Both for helping reduce risks, but also to open up different opportunities on both fronts. And then finally, what I'll wrap up with, in part because we're called We Mean Business, this is where we focus, is we need to move from the thousands of companies that are taking action, right, to millions. And I think the experience of the thousands that we have gone, big and small, and what they've been doing over several years demonstrates what every company needs to do, right? And I would put that into four A's. Ambition, right? Measuring emissions and setting science-based targets. Taking action. So this is creating and delivering a climate transition action plan. Advocacy. This is calling for policies and regulations that are needed to accelerate action and engaging in that ambition loop with policymakers. And then finally, and very importantly, is accountability, right? It's reporting, publicly on progress. And this is something at We Mean Business that we call the 4 A's of climate leadership. And we feel that these really form a basis of what credible corporate leadership is about. And I don't think I need to tell anyone here, right? But the transformation, it's a huge business opportunity for those who are at the forefront. And what we see, and I think what will come through very clearly today, is that business has a pivotal role in maintaining the 1.5 pathway, ensuring that we stay on track for that. And this is something I think we'll unpack and dig into from the following speakers. So I just wanted to set the scene there. I appreciate being here and looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Molly, thank you so much. That was tremendous. There's a lot there that you just spoke about. A couple of things that sort of came directly to mind is those stubborn methane emissions from all over the world. I would love for us to capture more of those methane emissions and actually turn them into a renewable product like renewable natural gas. We can do that. We are doing that. We just need to do more of it now. And then your comments around wastewater and treatment and the amount of energy that's going into these plants. One of my colleagues is fond of telling me that generally we expend a lot of energy at these treatment plants to destroy the energy that is coming into them, which means we need a paradigm shift in how we think about these assets. What can they really produce for us? So thank you. That was absolutely a wonderful way to start. And so we'll get right into the panel. So today we do have folks from a number of different places around the world. By my count, France, the UK, Canada, and the west coast of the United States and California, which is quite early for them. But also wanted to again point out Anna Jacobson. She's our business group leader for sustainability, resilience, ESG, and transactions in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So she'll be compiling some of the main messages that we hear today during the session. We'll be providing a wrap at the end. That's always a really tough task. It's a bit of a thankless task, I find. But the wonderful Anna will do a fantastic job. I know she will. So I'm going to be posing questions to our panelists today around 5 major themes. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists, the first time you answer a question, to just provide a little bit of an introduction to yourself. You don't need to do sort of a long one, but just give us a bit of a sense of who you are and where you might be sitting. Also, panel, I believe my wife is actually joining us for our discussion this morning. So please try to make me look good, okay? So with that, we're going to start with a theme of more than money. I often hear, sort of in travels around the world, that funding is one of the challenges in building new infrastructure. But at the same time, we often hear that there's a lot of investment looking for projects and programs in which to place their capital. So the question is, what are the main challenges in accessing funding to implement solutions across geographies? Like, what are these challenges around funding? And I think we're going to start with Mark from ENGIE. So Mark, if you could introduce yourself briefly and then dive right into the question, really appreciate it.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I'm Mark Akers. I've got about 30 odd years in the energy sector, and the last 15 spent mostly in renewables or the kind of innovative end of the business. And I'm currently in charge of strategy and M&A for the renewables business of ENGIE globally. Yeah, and I think on the question, clearly a critical question. I mean, what we find as a group is it's not so much a question of accessing the funding in a way that's as competitive as possible. On the equity side, what we do as a group is we generally seek to take a majority share in the renewable projects we invest in, and then we access competitive funding from investors. And we kind of position ourselves as the player playing the industrial and market role. So we take the development risk, the construction risk, operations, market exposure, routes to market, and all of those we take on board, which then kind of de-risks those aspects of the project for the financial investor, who's then more comfortable to come in on the most competitive terms. And that's a key element actually to the competitiveness of our ability to compete in the market. And maybe just in addition to that, just on the access to funding, I mean, in the last month or so, we've raised something like 6 billion euros for 3 offshore wind projects. So what we're finding is even for technology that's at the less mature end, even though it's beginning to become a reasonably mature technology, we're finding that provided you've got well prepared projects, good sponsors, secure offtake, even sometimes a bit innovative. I mean, one of those projects is a combination of CFD, Amazon, Google, merchant. So sometimes some innovative off-taker solutions, but you are able to get, you're able to attract that funding and able to attract funding on good terms.
Mark, quick follow-up on that. You deal with the investment community, you procure investment and funding for these projects. What do you estimate to be the number-one risk that you hear from the investment community around these projects? What's the biggest stumbling block in your opinion?
Well, I mean, if we look at what's been happening recently, I suppose I'm not sure it's the biggest, but it's certainly one that's been ramping up or ramped up very, very recently. Is the technical due diligence and the risk on capex. Given that the industry has gone through a tricky period over the last couple of years, we're certainly seeing investors paying a lot more attention to those technical topics and capex related topics and construction deadlines, those kind of things. And that was something that not too long ago was they generally kind of trusted us, and now they're asking to have a much closer look at those topics.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much, Mark. Maybe we'll turn over to Fernando from the City of Toronto. As Canada's largest municipality and a very progressive entity in the biofuels world, I think, Fernando, you'll have a pretty different perspective on this issue of funding. So please, I'll turn it over to you. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you for that. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Fernando Carew, and I'm with the City of Toronto. My focus has always been in my career, energy and climate. I previously worked with some of Canada's largest multinationals in many industries. And for the last 10 years, I've been at the City of Toronto leading climate and innovation. So I'm responsible for not only decarbonizing the corporation itself, but also we recognize that 95% of the emissions actually do not come from the corporation, but are held widely in the community, as you would expect, right? So when it comes to financing and funding, the City of Toronto, like many municipalities, we issue green bonds to fund and finance a number of projects, including climate projects. We also actually have low interest loan programs with up to 30 years amortization that we make available for residents, business institutions to decarbonize. And of course, we also have funding partners like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, Natural Resources Canada, and many others. So broadly speaking, so far, so knock on wood, this continues, but so far funding and financing has not been a limiting factor, with the caveat that is for mitigation projects, right? So when we decarbonize, when we displace, diesel in our transit fleet, or even, natural gas in our community centers, those projects tend to have a positive return on investment. So we don't have an issue, financing and funding those. The challenge actually is bundling and getting those projects off the ground, right? Now, there's a totally different story when it comes to adaptation and resilience for projects that generally don't have a clear business case. They're more of a risk mitigation strategy, right? And the city has 5% exposure on mitigation on emissions, but we have over 50% exposure on adaptation, given that we own so much infrastructure, right? So that's something that's becoming on top of mind, and we're going to be doing a lot of work in the coming months on trying to actually look at that uneven exposure given our infrastructure ownership. When it comes to the water energy nexus, City of Toronto, we've been a leader in leveraging water and wastewater infrastructure as large sources of renewable thermal energy. So, most of you or some of you would know that, we have the world's largest deep lake cooling system where we cool, 100 plus of the biggest buildings in downtown Toronto using cold lake water. And that's been a tremendous success. It was actually a city organization, a city corporation that got spun off. And not only we were doing good for the environment, but we did really well, for our balance sheet when we sold that business. And now it's been actually, dramatically increased. And then the other one actually, which is more recent, actually, is the wastewater. There was mention actually of wastewater to energy. So currently, actually, we're in the process of delivering the largest raw wastewater project in the world. We're decarbonizing a very large hospital campus by using energy from waste. And that's a program that has a lot of potential. We could be decarbonizing, almost, or a lot of actually hospital and educational campuses that tend to be close to the resource at a very economical cost, given that connecting to wastewater generally actually avoids the need to have very expensive geo exchange bore field, right? So no, pretty bullish actually on the funding and financing, and so far we haven't had an issue for grid projects, but I think adaptation will be a totally different challenge.
Okay, thank you for that, Fernando. I just also wanted to point out your food waste system in the city of Toronto. I think it's the largest collection of municipal food waste in all of North America, and that's all being anaerobically digested, or most of it's being anaerobically digested with a view towards creating renewable natural gas. So that's definitely a leading system as well. But I do want to ask you about, from a municipal perspective, the city has also declared, to my knowledge, a climate emergency. And how does that factor into this discussion for you?
Yeah, no, good point, actually. So we've recalculated actually our climate action plan. So a year and a half ago, we went back to our council to reauthorize our climate action plan. And we've accelerated to net zero emissions community-wide by 2040. So we have a renewed commitment, and we've made a lot of investments. We grew our team almost threefold, the climate action team in the last few years. So we'll continue to actually make those investments, given that the business case is quite clear on getting off fossil fuels, and the idea also on the adaptation side actually is to avoid that risk as the climate changes. So we have full support. It's not easy, right? But if it was easy, it would have been done by now, right? So we work on stuff that it's hard, but it's necessary. So we're quite well positioned.
Well, thank you for showing the way amongst municipalities, because you're definitely leading amongst North American entities anyway. You mentioned business cases there, so I'm going to jump to our next topic, which is infrastructure requirements, and really talk about business cases, because it really does come down to that. So on building a more compelling business case, what lessons, panel, can we learn from projects within your companies for untapping further opportunities and solidifying the case for not just continuing with the energy transition, but in accelerating it? So what have we seen? What lessons can we learn to improve business cases over time? And I think I'm going to turn that question over to Jamie out in California. Jamie, if I know PG&E is heavily vested in, for instance, hydrogen space, which is a very unique opportunity, but also a challenge. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then if you could into the question, that'd be great.
Good morning. Thanks for having me today. So I'm Jamie Randolph. I am the Principal Hydrogen Program Manager in our Greenhouse Gas Emission Strategy team within the gas engineering section of Pacific Gas and Electric Company. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we're the largest energy utility in California, providing electricity and gas to over 16 million people. And our transmission and distribution networks span 70 square miles service area. Sorry, getting tongue twisted there. We also provide 96% clean emission-free electricity already. In 2022, our electricity came from mostly carbon-free resources. 40% was from eligible renewables, 49% from nuclear, and 7% from hydropower. So we're heading in the right direction. We also have a goal, like City of Toronto, to get to net zero by 2040. And one of the largest challenges that we see standing in the way of appropriate investments in California is this lack of hydrogen infrastructure. So California's already started building out a hydrogen market a little bit ahead of some of the other parts of North America. There's some other areas around the world that are doing this as well. But what we're seeing is there's the lack of that midstream component to transport it. So there's producers and end users. We're seeing tons of energy projects that are including these developments, and they're having problems getting that hydrogen to the end users. So PG&E is working on a project that we're calling Hydrogen to Infinity, and this is to close knowledge gaps for repurposing the existing natural gas infrastructure at the transmission level. So looking at high pressure transmission infrastructure in our existing stuff in figuring out how to use that infrastructure to take the hydrogen from the producer to the end user. When it gets to that end user, we want to be able to use separation technology so that they can accept pure hydrogen if they need to, or just get natural gas. For those that can take a blend, great. That's not a problem, but really it's to accelerate getting that hydrogen infrastructure going for those that want to use that to help with the energy portfolio, because we see it being used for that long duration energy storage as we're trying to shift away from fossil fuels and to capture. We have a lot of renewables that gets curtailed right now in California. So we want to be able to turn that into hydrogen so we can store it seasonally and use it later on. Right now, our natural gas system really does that job for us. And we're trying to go from fossil fuels to renewable natural gas and hydrogen mix to take that on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamie. So I really love the idea of using the natural gas grids, which do offer an immense amount of storage, as you say, to actually store hydrogen because it's existing infrastructure. We can take advantage of that infrastructure. What do you think the number one challenge is with respect to social acceptance of doing that? What do you hear from the public in terms of this discussion around hydrogen suddenly being blended into the natural gas system that comes into their houses?
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of fears. A lot of people think about the Hindenburg, right? They think about explosions when they hear hydrogen. But what they don't realize is hydrogen is already a known commodity, right? We already have standards around how to manage it safely, just like we do natural gas and electricity. They all can be dangerous if not handled properly. They can all cause fires, explosions. And it's trying to help the communities and the residents and our customers understand that we're not going to do anything if we can't do it safely with the right regulations and the right protocols in place. So that's why we're doing the Hydrogen to Infinity project, is to make sure we can do all this safely, not impact the reliability, not put anyone in harm's way before we start blending into our system.
Got it. So no blimps in your future, I take it.
Yeah, not for us.
Yeah, no, not for anyone, I suspect. All right, well, thank you very much, Jamie. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Devrim. Devrim, please let us know a little bit about yourself, and if you could sort of address the question around challenges and business cases, we'd love to hear it from your perspective. All right, you're on mute, Devrim.
Someone had to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Devrim, I lead the Kraken Flex team. We're part of the Octopus Energy Group. We're a fairly young organization, been only around 7 years, 7 years in April last month. We are a global energy retail and technology company. We're most known around the world for our electricity retail business, which in the UK is already the second largest retailer. We have about $7 billion of renewable assets under management. And then Kraken, the part of the business where I stay in, is a software platform that underpins everything we do. Now, even though Kraken also underpins our competitive advantage in the market, we're in the mission of enabling a affordable energy transition. And because of that, we license Kraken to even the competitors of Octopus Energy globally. Therefore, we get involved in projects of every size, the likes of infrastructure projects we're talking on this call, but also quite heavily on consumer-owned energy resources as well. And I'd like to take your question in both from those two dimensions. On the infrastructure side, like Mark said, there's abundance of money. I think the amount of money invested into clean tech last year was $1.1 trillion. The challenge is getting the projects off the ground, and our experience is it takes about 6 to 7 years to get a wind project live in the United Kingdom today. There's no reason why it should take any more than a year. The challenge is planning, permitting and planning. Just it takes too long. A lot of it is done at the national level, especially if the assets are large scale. In fact, the Elia Group, which is the Belgian system operator, did a study a couple of years ago. And to get the conclusion was to get European grids green by 2050, we would have to develop 4 times to 5 times more renewable infrastructure. Even if we push the level of what we can achieve with the current planning regime, we'll probably get to about 2.5 to 3 times. So I think the largest challenge is planning. From a consumer technologies perspective, which can contribute incredibly to energy transition, the challenges are more structural, market structures. Our current structures, talking again in competitive market regimes, it's driven to incentivize generation, but not to incentivize demand to behave differently. And if you can change the demand profiles, then we can maximize the use of green electrons, and in such a way that we can manage the distribution infrastructure the way it is without having to build significant capacity to transport those electrons. So if our theme is affordable energy transition, think planning, let's build a lot of renewables very fast, and also let's incentivize consumers so they buy more electric vehicles, which they're doing anyway, but then they consume electricity in a way that maximizes electrons, green electrons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And I go back to Jamie's commentary as well. I wonder if that future of green electrons suddenly becoming green molecules by way of hydrogen is another way of moving this energy. You know, that hydrogen molecule seems to connect our natural gas and electrical grids all of a sudden and create a bit of a bridge. So yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you. Okay, we're going to head off to our next theme, identifying and navigating obstacles. I know there's a lot. I think Molly talked to a number of them at the beginning. I think, Devram, your take on the permitting and planning component is really interesting. We do a lot of that work, and I think the lack of really established clear permitting pathways for large-scale projects is a problem because it takes so long to go through the process, and there's inherent risk in the process as well, which we're constantly navigating around the world. It's an interesting challenge. I wish it was more streamlined. I wish it was more prescriptive so that we could move through it more quickly. But one of the obstacles we also see as a consulting firm, I mean, we're an engineering firm, but we really find that there's a really big challenge in the access to talent. And we ask ourselves constantly, where are we going to find all the people to enable such a large transition around the world? How do we even retrain existing talent? How do we work with young professionals? I mean, I think that's one of the main things that we face. But I'm interested in hearing from the panel about what they're seeing in terms of these, key obstacles that we're seeing in the field. So what are the challenges and obstacles your company is facing in navigating the energy transition? And I think we're going to start with Fernando on this one.
Sure, thank you. The infrastructure actually is obviously a huge part, being a municipality, right? And like I mentioned, we have sort of a bit of an uneven exposure, to mitigations 5%, but then when it comes actually to infrastructure, if you look at all the roads and the water and wastewater infrastructure, if you include actually our own utility, Toronto Hydro, then the infrastructure actually obviously is a very large component. One of the strategies that we have on the business case actually is that infrastructure is not static, so it gets essentially rebuilt every year, to the tune of 3 to 5%. So the concept actually is that we can do better by improving actually sort of the design requirements of roads and water and wastewater infrastructure, bridges, and so on. With a very small delta, with presumably a little bit better materials or strategies that do not add significantly actually to the overall cost of the project, right? So while you're doing a big project, you're rebuilding a big bridge, doing water and wastewater work, you can do better by designing for future weather, right? So that business case actually is quite it's quite actually sort of understood actually, and we really don't have actually a lot of pushback or criticality to it. I think, like I mentioned before, actually, where we are starting to wrap our heads around actually is the whole idea of the adaptation and mitigation and the adaptation and resilience side, which it's difficult in the sense that we know we have to design to a future weather, but I don't think actually, and I'm an engineer, I don't think the engineering community actually agrees on what would that endpoint be, given that it could be a shifting sort of scenario motivated also by how much we mitigate, right? So I think that the challenge actually will continue to be in terms of sort of that elusive business case in our view when it comes to actually resilience and adaptation, for which you can't ascribe a clear benefit in terms of like the way you can actually with phasing out fossil fuels, right? To give you an example, and this is I'm sure known to the audience, that as we decarbonize, for example, our transit fleet, which is actually the largest energy user in the city, we are avoiding purchasing diesel. And diesel actually is the highest cost energy you'll ever buy, right? Maybe second to gasoline, but when it comes to transit. So we expect actually, essentially, we know that we have a positive NPV on that actually exercise. We just got funding from the federal government, and we're going to be having. We had the largest actually electric bus fleet. Then for a little while, actually, we were second or third. Now we're going to go back on top of being number one, and we hope to decarbonize our entire fleet by 2030. And as we do it, actually, the savings as the buses continue to come down in price will also be used to decarbonize buildings and infrastructure. So the idea that the costlier energy by transitioning from mobile fuels to electricity, there's a clear business case in that case. And it also applies. We have actually obviously a program for residents. That's actually true also actually in terms of a household, right? As electric vehicles continue to come down in price and be available in more segments, we can see a clear path, of parity in terms of cost of ownership or cost of purchase for electric vehicle. So that will result actually essentially in a pretty enticing business case for a family where you would avoid thousands of dollars per vehicle on fuel and avoided maintenance. But that can be actually reinvested hopefully in decarbonizing the household itself. So pretty bullish about the mitigation, but quite concerned about the adaptation business case.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that. So the adaptation case may not carry an obvious positive business case. That's what I'm kind of hearing from you, Fernando. So how do you deal with your municipal council and the residents of the city, which is what, 2.7 million people now, when you go before your council and you go before residents with something that's not got a positive business case? How is that received?
Yeah, no, good question. So we're if anything, we're creative and innovative. So when it comes, for example, to we had issues of basement flooding, like many cities do, as the climate changes and you get more intense rains, right, and precipitation. So we were able to tuck that resilience adaptation project into the water rate system, but we don't have a clear path on how to do that for roads, aside from the incremental sort of material choices that I described, like sort of higher modulus, temperature, for asphalt, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe, better, more actually structure on bridges, for snow load and so on, right? There are issues around, floodplains. There are issues around, the purpose. So, green streets to be able to actually accommodate for stormwater, right? That we don't have a clear path. I have to say that we have had good partnership from other levels of government. Like currently, we are working on the largest brownfield or waterfront redevelopment in the city of Toronto and the Portlands, and essentially that's a $1.5 billion floodplain mitigation project to renaturalize the mouth of the downriver, and so that's actually a very, very large, adaptation and mitigation project, which clearly couldn't be funded actually on a business case basis in terms of recovery, even at land prices actually at the rate of Toronto. So good point, Taj. So in that case actually we had to actually, and I think going forward there'll be a bigger role, for other levels of government to invest in local and municipal infrastructure.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much, Fernando. Okay, so maybe we'll turn it over to Mark. Mark, what are the challenges and obstacles that ENGIE is facing as sort of a global company? I mean, you see a lot of things around the world. What are the challenges and obstacles you've seen in navigating the energy transition?
Yeah, thanks, Tej. And I think I'm going to come back to a few points. Molly, you mentioned, I think, the full list, and really relate to what you said, Devrim, and you said yourself, Tej, about both permitting and talent, and maybe focusing on a couple of different ones. One is, if you look at the scale of the ambitions, out to 2030, if we just look at the markets that ENGIE is operating in, I think it's something like 1.5 terawatts of renewable capacity that's supposed to be added between now and 2030, according to the ambitions. And that's like the size of the entire EU current installed capacity, of all technologies, whichever technology you take, over a 7-year period. So it's absolutely phenomenal. And as was mentioned, the entire supply chain, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to keep up with that. And on the other hand, if we're going to remain on the trajectory we need to be on, these technologies are mature. They can be built at scale. They're generally competitive. I mean, they hadn't been historically, but are now in most markets, there's at least one either onshore wind or solar that are actually competitive, the most competitive source of energy. So we need to be building them out. This period up to 2030 is really a critical period, I think, for the planet as a whole, in fact, in terms of getting those capacities on the ground. And so pointing to two others, one is the key is equipment. And we've had a period over the last couple of years where it's actually been difficult to access equipment. So I'm talking about solar PV modules, wind turbines. Prices of that tension has been visible in what's been happening on capex prices. And I think there's a role for both industry, so us as a market player, to make sure that we understand our suppliers and that we're able to actually negotiate contracts and deals that at the end of the day are a win-win. So we're able to get the what we need in terms of the equipment and competitive prices, but we also understand the challenges they're facing and make sure that the way we purchase kind of aligns with those challenges. But there's also a policy dimension which has been picked up. I mean, which I think has clearly been seen. What we find, if you take the big kind of renewable regions of the world, is that it seems that there's that introducing a local manufacturing dimension to manufacturing, which I think is, from a security of supply point of view, given the scale of development we're talking about, seems to be something that's important. It seems as if we look at the big markets, we're working in India, we're working in the US, we're working across Europe. Clearly, that's happening quite quickly. It's already in place to some extent. In India and in the US, it's ramping up very quickly. We're already having conversations about buying gigawatts of capacity from new local suppliers and existing local suppliers in the US in the next couple of years. In Europe, that's clearly ramping up much more slowly, and I think policymakers are seeking to address this, but I do think that's an urgent issue. The second one I point to, and it was kind of alluded to, one aspect was alluded to by Devrim, is networks. And this is often, not really directly addressed by a lot of the policies that are out there. On the other hand, it's absolutely critical, because if the power plants are there, and the network connections, the network capacity isn't there, one way or another, that's a cost, because you're getting curtailment, if you're getting, basis risk between two different price points, as you do in some markets, that's a cost to investors and developers. So it's absolutely essential that in the short term, the network capacity, the connection, are there and are available to make sure that all of this capacity that's being built can actually get into the system. And then I would say over the longer term, picking up the point Devrim made, the system we're going to be in post, say, 2030 is going to look very, very different to the system that was designed, after the war. And we need to make sure that we've got heavily interconnected, strongly interconnected networks, so we can really capture that renewable resource, where it is. If it's offshore wind that's producing a lot if we take Europe, for example, in the north of Europe, we can get that across Europe. If it's, if it's the solar energy that's particularly present, we can get that into the system and get that transmitted across Europe. And secondly, that all of the flexibility that is available, and as Devrim mentioned, electric vehicles, on-site generation, behind-the-meter battery storage, demand response, all the digital solutions that exist and will continue to be developed to support this. These are flexibility resources that the system desperately needs, but they're not located where they used to be in the way the system was designed. So systems need to be able to capture all of those flexibility resources. So I'd say from our perspective, there's the immediate challenge of making sure of getting the equipment and getting the network access. And then looking forward, I think there are those other challenges, or that particularly on the network side, there's that other challenge of making sure that we actually have a system that's really designed to operate and optimize what we have actually that's connected. There are a couple of other points, but I think I can see time's ticking by, so I'll stop there. But happy to come back on a few other points on that. I think it really is, from our perspective, absolutely critical at the moment. What in terms of everything that's happening.
Yeah, it is a tremendous infrastructure challenge, isn't it, around our connected grids all across the world, and what they need to do to adapt and to include storage into the system as well, which we badly need. I do have one quick follow-up for you, Mark. You did mention India, you mentioned the United States. One of the things I consistently am hearing around policy is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is really attracting a lot of the investment around the world to go into the US to take advantage of production tax credits, investment tax credits, things of that nature. Are you feeling that pull as well as Engie to the US?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there was a before and an after the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, it's one of those great, there's big policy instruments that historically the US has been able to leverage, and yeah, I mean, it gives visibility at least for 10 years. It's a single piece of legislation. It's kind of incentive driven, so you develop the projects that you want to develop and capture the incentives. You know what the incentives are that are out there. So we do think it's it's a particularly effective policy making tool, and it kind of has become yeah. So we're certainly seeing. We're going to continue to develop projects across the world. We'll continue. Clearly, Europe's a key market to us, and we're going to continue to develop projects in Europe. But we are seeing that there's a clear change to the kind of framework within the US, and yeah, and we see that kind of simplifying, both incentivizing and simplifying at the same time on a considerable scale. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much, Mark. Okay, well, we'll jump to our next theme, which is navigating existing and new technologies. Transition is going to require new technologies. It's going to require new approaches. So I'd like to talk about scale-up success stories around new technologies in the energy transition space. What lessons have we learned? How can they be applied to new and emerging technologies? And I think this one is really well suited, Devrim, to you, and love to get your take on this one.
Yeah, sure, Tej. So I'll take it in two dimensions. The first one on the infrastructure side, and this may sound odd, but I think battery storage, especially large-scale battery storage, has been a great story. UK started its journey a little bit earlier in around 2014-15, and for a while we only had small megawatts of storage that operated in very secure revenue markets. It was almost structured finance, as you would do with large-scale solar and wind. But then we had a complete collapse of that, and they went from literally overnight from structured, beautiful products to merchant world, and it survived. And today we have just shy of 2.5 gigawatts of storage in the UK system. It's probably going to double by the end of this year, if not more. And we have a planning pipeline, and we talked about what that may or may not mean, of another 30 gigawatts plus of that project. And we got really good at deploying these. We went up that learning curve quite rapidly. So I think that's a good story of energy transition. And now US is following on that. And I see, and we talked about Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of money running away from European projects to build projects in Texas particularly. And we'll see how many of those will materialize. On the consumer end, yeah, Molly said EVs went from 5 to 15%, and that's quite incredible because we've hit the S curve on that. In the UK today, over 2/3 of cars sold every month are electric. And the way we're adapting it as a society is incredible. People building their own charge points at home, public charging infrastructure isn't there. And it's a good question mark if we really need it at big scale, because if you can charge it at home, probably not such a big deal. But we're also seeing the other element of that, which consumers actually care about how they charge those cars and what that means to the environment. And we've been running a program where we ask consumers what they like, and they tell us, I need my car charged by 80% by 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. Go and figure out how to do it. They get a massive discount on cars that go into the electron. That's their benefit. That's clear, transparent benefit to them. But the number of people signing up to this is growing by 30% every month, practically no advertising, which to me says there's two success stories of energy transition there. One, people are buying these cars with or without the infrastructure, but they're also signing up to programs that give control away when these are charged. And there's a trust element to that, to a utility that can schedule them in such a way to make sure it runs all within the existing system, and we don't need to upgrade the networks, and we can maximize use of renewable energy.
Okay, that's fantastic, Devrim. I'm curious, you talked about EVs, and we heard that, great statistic of the 15% from Molly. Do you see a place for fuel cell vehicles running on hydrogen in the future as well? Do you see a parallel potential uptake for them in the market?
No,
Okay.
because when you do the economics, it just doesn't stack up.
Not even in sort of the long haul trucking fleets or the heavier vehicles or transit fleets. You don't see any place for sort of hydrogen in the fueling side of the world?
I would say small potentially, but I think battery energy storage will answer those questions as well.
Okay. And then I'm curious about the battery energy storage component as well. Mark talked about supply chain challenges, and I wonder what your concerns are around supply chain, and does that delve all the way back into sort of critical minerals like lithium that are needed for things like batteries? Are you concerned about that?
So two aspects to your question. Primarily, I agree with everything Mark said about supply chain issues, especially through lockdown. A lot of projects got delayed. But interestingly, when you look at why most battery projects were delayed, it was less to do with power electronics or storage in the batteries. It was more to do with, especially these high voltage connected assets, it was transformers, because they were all custom designed and they just couldn't get custom equipment to sites in time. In terms of lithium, so I think we're doing things to use less rare earth metals in batteries, but it's obviously a challenge, both the way it's mined and what it means and what we're going to do with them at the end of their lives, especially electric vehicle batteries.
Mm-hmm.
But there are challenges. I think some really good ideas are coming through the pipeline that should be able to address.
Yeah, I like that we're starting to see the beginnings of a lithium recycling industry as part of circular economy.
Yeah.
We are starting to see that emerge now as well, which I think is very important. All right, thank you very much, Devrim. We're going to jump to our last issue, our last theme, which is not just energy, but also the water issue. Obviously, water and energy is strongly interconnected. So I want to talk about what are some of the strategies that people are using to address the water energy nexus, because there clearly is a nexus between the two. And I think I'd like to start with Jamie on that from the PG&E perspective.
Sure. So, we're really into renewable natural gas and capturing that from wastewater treatment plants and using it. But one of the other things that we're doing in our Hydrogen to Infinity project, one of our collaborators, Northern California Power Agency, they'll be creating the hydrogen from electrolysis, and they're going to be using reclaimed water from the city of Lodi's water treatment facility there. So it's located just adjacent to the existing Lodi Energy Center, which is a power plant that can blend up to 45% hydrogen. They're going to be one of our off-takers of our Hydrogen to Infinity project, but they're going to be creating that electrolysis and using that reclaimed water. They already use the reclaimed water at that power plant right now as they're cooling. So they're using recycled water now, but they're going to use even more of it and continue to find ways to use that. And we're hoping that it builds a use case that can be replicated other places. Being able to recycle that water and use it for other purposes instead of just putting it back into the ocean or wherever it's going to go, right? Be able to find a good use for it. We think that it's really important to have a nature positive solution that we can work towards. PG&E is really looking at how we can focus on biodiversity in the long term and going beyond just near like zero energy, net zero. By 2050, PG&E is going towards how do we be nature positive and climate positive. So how do we improve the climate, not just keep it, at zero.
Mm-hmm. So I find that really interesting. So you're taking water from a treatment plant, so reclaimed water, as your feedstock for your hydrogen electrolysis project, and then you're putting the hydrogen into the natural gas system. California has obviously been water limited for a very long time. Do you think, given California's significant ambitions around hydrogen, of which there are many, do you think there's enough water really to supply that ambition through green hydrogen? Is the reclaimed water strategy going to be enough to supply enough water into that hydrogen market there?
Yeah, that's a big question that we've had. In Northern California, we think it's going to be fine. There are some concerns about it in Southern California and how are they going to do that. So we may see that more of that green hydrogen is created more in the northern half of California and then transported across the state. But they're still looking for solutions on how they're going to get that water in the Southern California region.
Okay.
But that is one solution that hopefully we can leverage, is using that wastewater if they can put things near that. But if we can blend it into the gas system, we're looking at up to 30% in the Hydrogen to Infinity project. It will be, over the course of time that we do that, but that's a huge amount of hydrogen. And we couldn't even, if we blended 5% in our existing system, that's way beyond what the market can use at the moment. So we would be able to supply a lot of that end use supply that would be coming.
Okay, really interesting. Well, I think, we are getting close to the end of the hour now, so I think we should probably cap it there. Fantastic discussion. I feel like I have a lot more questions that I could ask and really want to ask, but thank you for some fantastic insights here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna Jacobson, who's been waiting very patiently in the wings to provide our wonderful summary. I'll turn it over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Tash. I'll do my best to summarize this incredibly interesting and dynamic discussion, and I'm conscious I only have a few minutes. I thought it was fantastic sort of kickoff with Molly taking us through, I guess, a stock take in terms of where we are. Lots of good news. Many of the solutions that are needed to facilitate energy transition are already available today. With renewable energies making up an increasing share of the global energy production and usage, and are competitive solutions. We also heard about companies increasingly taking action to decarbonize, realizing that the energy transition is actually a huge business opportunity, not just a sort of cost item. There's obviously a lot more work to do to accelerate that transition. Emissions are still rising. So that's something we need to respond to with increasing scale and speed. And we need to move from thousands of businesses taking actions to the millions. And we heard a lot around, funding. Is it a lever? Is it a challenge? Is it a bit of both? Obviously, a key challenge to implementing solutions in terms of both accessing the most competitive funding solutions, but also demonstrating that business case and return on investment can be challenging for some of the solutions. We also heard that the investment ratio, so fossil fuels to renewable energy, needs to be shifted from the 1-to-1 it is today to 9-to-1 by 2030. So large scale up is needed of that funding, including, importantly, in the supporting infrastructure. So a lot of discussion was around kind of network capacity and connection. I think it's also noted that really positively net zero is obviously an increasing priority for investors as part of their ESG investment strategies, and therefore support for these projects that contribute to the energy transition and emission reduction is only looking to increase. We heard that mitigation side of things is potentially a bit more easily showcased than adaptation measures. So we need to look at other levers there as well to gain the support and funding, including the role of government to invest in local infrastructure there. I think just to really briefly sum up, there were a few sort of really main takeaways for me in terms of themes. I think the importance of partnership and collaboration was mentioned by almost all of the panelists in terms of, finance to de-risk those investments, and technology to accelerate innovation, and with industry to understand, what's in the supply chain, what's needed to deliver the scale of renewable growth that is needed to meet targets that are set globally, regionally, nationally. And also that governments need to be bold. They need to support businesses. They need to set targets. They need to set timelines to phase out fossil fuels We need clear policy landscapes. We need simple kind of fiscal and market-based instruments to help mature and scale solutions like hydrogen, taking lessons learned from wind and solar. We heard that planning and permitting processes need to really speed up, and also we need consumers to be incentivized in terms of their buying and usage behaviors, and also have that supporting infrastructure in place, so the EV uptake being an example that was discussed. And very, very lastly, I thought really importantly, throughout the energy transition, we need to ensure that we have that system integrity, that we have an interconnected, flexible and optimized network, and that we also bring communities and the general public along with us and ensure that energy access is affordable, because any transition needs to be just, needs to be equitable. We need to look at social issues like jobs and human rights alongside the importance of addressing environmental concerns.
Anna, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for that great wrap up. And thank you to the entire panel. Molly, thank you for your opening. I'm going to turn it over to Luke because we're right at the hour now.
Perfect. Yeah, and I would like to second that. Big thank you to our speakers today, and particularly GHD for working with us on this very insightful webinar. That was fantastic. Do encourage our audience to say subscribe to Reuters Events content throughout our content on the energy transition, renewables and hydrogen. You will, as the audience, have a full audio replay within a week. So do share this with our colleagues, clients, and the broader energy transition community. The aim for this is to act as a catalyst for change in the industry. Thank you again for tuning in, and I do wish you a pleasant rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.